Before there were empires, before there were kingdoms, before the world divided itself by borders and names, there was a single voice that rose from the heart of Africa. It wasn't the voice of conquest or power. It was the voice of creation. It was the first language of humankind, spoken not through technology or translation, but through vibration, rhythm, and meaning. From the valleys of the Nile to the savannas of the Niger, the first words ever spoken by humanity were born in Africa. And from those sounds came the foundation of all communication, all understanding, all civilization. The world learned to speak because Africa first taught it how language is more than words. It is memory. It carries emotion, identity, and heritage. Every syllable is a fragment of history. Every tone a pulse of ancestry. When you trace back the linguistic map of the world, all paths lead to Africa. Modern linguists, historians, and anthropologists have discovered what the ancestors already knew, that the root of global speech from the languages of Asia to Europe and the Americas began with the tongues of Africa. The early humans who migrated from the continent carried not only their bodies but their voices, their oral traditions, their songs, and their words across the earth. What began as the sound of life in Africa became the language of humanity. Think about this for a moment. Every word you speak today carries an echo of Africa within it. Whether it's the sound of laughter, a whisper of comfort, or the rhythm of song, it is all born from that original spark. The power of language was Africa's first gift to the world. It allowed people to connect, to build, to dream. Through language they shared knowledge, created stories, and built civilizations. It was not a weapon, it was wisdom. It was not a tool for division, it was a bridge between souls. And that is what made Africa the cradle not just of life but of understanding. When we speak of ancient African civilizations like Kemet, Nubia, and Kush, we often think of pyramids and monuments. But beyond those stones stood something far greater, the knowledge encoded in words. The hieroglyphs of Kemet were not mere drawings. They were a visual language that captured the essence of the human spirit. Each symbol spoke of science, philosophy, and spirituality. They weren't simply writing, they were breathing the soul of a people into eternity. Even older than Kemet were the mother languages of Africa's interior languages, filled with tones, clicks, and inflections, so complex that they mirrored the very heartbeat of creation itself. Many of the world's languages, whether Semitic, Indo-European, or Dravidian, bear traces of African phonetics, structure, and rhythm. Yet for centuries this truth was hidden or denied. Colonial scholars built theories that placed civilization elsewhere, erasing Africa's contribution to humanity's voice. But history, like truth, cannot stay buried forever. Today, linguistic science confirms what African oral traditions always preserved, that the first human language, the proto-language of all others, began in Africa over 100,000 years ago. This wasn't just coincidence, it was destiny. The African tongue became the blueprint for human thought, emotion, and communication. Language shaped consciousness. It allowed human beings to name the world around them, to describe beauty, to express fear, to declare love. It was language that gave form to imagination and structure to society. From the first lullabies sung by African mothers to the chants of ancient rituals under the stars, the continent gave birth to the human voice in all its forms. That voice then traveled the earth, evolving, adapting, and taking on new sounds. Yet no matter how far it went, it always carried the genetic code of its origin, the African code of expression, rhythm, and connection. The African origin of language is not just a historical fact, it's a mirror reflecting who we are as a human family. It reminds us that before we were divided by race, religion, or nation, we were united by sound. The first words that ever rose into the air did not belong to one tribe, they belonged to all of humanity. Africa's gift was never meant to be kept, it was meant to be shared, and it was shared so beautifully that even today in every corner of the world, the pulse of Africa can be heard in the laughter of children, in the call of song, in the words of poets, and in the language of love itself. But language is more than history, it's power. When a people lose their language, they lose part of their identity. That's why colonization didn't begin with chains, It began with silence. When invaders came to Africa, they didn't only take land and resources. They took words. They imposed foreign tongues, erased native languages, and silenced the songs that carried generations of wisdom. Yet even in that silence, Africa's voice refused to die. It lived in secret conversations, in coded songs of resistance, in the rhythm of the drum, and in the heartbeat of a people who never forgot how to speak to one another without words. Today that voice is rising again. Across the diaspora, African languages are being reclaimed, studied, and celebrated. Young people are learning Yoruba, Igbo, Swahili, Zulu, Twi, and many more. They are reconnecting with the original sounds of their ancestors, the very syllables that shaped civilization. Each word they learn is an act of liberation. Each sentence spoken is a declaration that Africa's voice is eternal. Because to speak an African language is to speak the world's first truth, to reconnect with the beginning of human understanding. The beauty of African languages lies not only in their diversity but in their depth. Many African words do not simply describe, they embody. The name of a person often carries meaning, power, and prophecy. The language is intertwined with the spiritual, with nature, and with the collect. Unlike modern languages that separate the speaker from the world, African languages unite them with it. They remind us that words are not just sounds. They are energy. They create, they heal, and they connect. And that wisdom is something the modern world still struggles to grasp. The African origin of language also carries a powerful lesson about identity. It teaches us that knowledge, wisdom, and creativity are not the property of a few nations. They are humanity's shared inheritance, born from one source. Africa was not the student of civilization, it was the teacher. And through language it taught the world how to think, how to express, how to connect. When we honor that truth, we honor the origin of all people. When we silence it, we deny ourselves the full story of who we are. It's time to unlearn the falsehood that Africa was silent until others gave it a voice. The truth is the opposite. The world was silent until Africa spoke. The first songs, the first stories, the first philosophies were all shaped in the tongues of the mother continent. The poetry of the griots, the chants of the priests, the storytelling of the elders, all carried the wisdom that built civilizations. And when those words crossed oceans through migration or force, they didn't vanish. They transformed into new languages, new rhythms, new songs. The diaspora still carries those linguistic roots in the cadence of speech, in the rhythm of music, in the call and response of conversation. So when you hear the echo of an African drum, when you listen to the cadence of soul music, or when you feel the poetry of language move your heart, you're not just hearing art, you're hearing the continuation of something ancient, something sacred. You're hearing Africa speaking again through the ages, reminding us that the gift of voice began there. The African origin of language is a story of resilience, connection, and truth. It reminds us that our voices are sacred instruments of creation, that to speak is to shape reality. Africa gave humanity that power, and now as her children rediscover their roots, they are also rediscovering their voice. That voice will not be silenced again. It will rise in classrooms, in songs, in speeches, and in every corner of the world where truth still breathes. Because in the end, the story of language is the story of us. And that story began not in the towers of Europe, nor in the temples of the East, but in the cradle of Africa, where the first words were spoken beneath the same sky that still watches over us today. Africa taught the world to speak. And now it is time for the world to listen. Before the world learned to speak, Africa was already telling its story. Long before alphabets, grammar, or written words existed, there was sound, pure, rhythmic, and alive. And in the heart of the African continent, those sounds became meaning. The cradle of humanity was also the cradle of expression. Every tone, every vibration, every rhythm that once echoed through the savannas carried more than just noise. It carried connection. It was Africa that first shaped the art of sound into the gift of speech, transforming silence into communication and isolation into unity. When we talk about the origin of language, we are not merely tracing history, we are rediscovering the human soul that learned to speak through the voice of Africa. Before the world had nations, tribes, or borders, Our ancestors in Kemet, Nubia, and across the great rivers of the continent spoke with purpose. Their languages were born not from conquest, but from the need to connect with the earth, with each other, and with the divine rhythm of life itself. They named the stars, the rivers, the seasons, and the spirits long before writing ever appeared on stone. Each word carried memory. Each sound held wisdom. The earliest languages were not just tools of survival, they were songs of gratitude, reflections of harmony between humans and nature. Africa didn't just give birth to humanity, it gave humanity the power to articulate thought, emotion, and spirit. Modern linguistics traces nearly every language back to a root, a mother tongue that scholars call Proto-African. It is said that before English, Arabic, Chinese, or Sanskrit, there were African voices resonating across the plains. Those early speakers used clicks, tones, and rhythmic sounds that still live today in the San and Kosan languages of southern Africa. Their speech patterns carried emotion and intention in ways that transcended mere words. They communicated through the rhythm of their hearts. When you hear a drum beat, when you feel music move through you, that is the same frequency of Africa's first speech. The pulse of creation through sound. What makes this truth so powerful is that language is not just about communication, it is about identity. It shapes the way we think, how we see ourselves, and how we relate to the world. When we lose a language, we lose a piece of our memory. When we silence a tongue, we erase a chapter of our collective story. But Africa's languages, though many have been buried under colonial influence, still whisper through every dialect spoken today. Words like mama and papa, found across nearly every culture on earth, trace their roots back to Africa's earliest expressions. Even the way we structure sound, emotion, and meaning, all of it began there. The very concept of naming, the act of giving something identity through speech, was an African creation. The world has often been told that civilization began elsewhere, that Africa was silent while others discovered thought and logic, but the truth defies that lie. The very first word uttered by human lips came from African soil. Those words carried meaning long before writing, long before the libraries of Greece or the temples of Rome. In those African villages, under the sun and stars, humanity first learned to speak and therefore learned to dream. The earliest storytellers came from the same lands that gave birth to life itself. Their voices carried lessons, myths, and truths that became the foundation of human culture. When we trace the evolution of language, we trace the evolution of thought, and that path always leads back to Africa. The legacy of African speech was not only in spoken word but in the philosophy behind it. Ancient Kemet, for example, viewed language as divine energy, the spoken vibration that could create or destroy. They called it Heka, meaning the power of the word. To speak was to shape reality. Words were not empty. They were sacred forces that could heal, inspire, or transform. This belief didn't just influence African civilization, it shaped the world's spiritual and philosophical tradition. The idea that words have power, that speech is sacred, that the tongue can give life or death, all of that began in Africa. Every culture that came afterward borrowed from this truth, whether they realized it or not. When African people were scattered across the world through colonization and enslavement, they carried their linguistic rhythm with them. Though the words changed, the tone, the cadence, the soul remained. From the chants of the Caribbean to the spirituals of America, from the Creole languages of the Atlantic to the proverbs of West Africa, the heartbeat of African speech continued. It became the melody of resistance and the voice of identity. Even today, when African descendants speak, sing, or preach, there is a rhythm in their tone that can be traced back to the motherland. Language, no matter how far it travels, remembers its root. The beauty of this truth is that Africa's gift of language is not confined to history. It is alive in every word we speak today. When you say I am, you are using a concept that was born from ancient expressions of existence in Africa. When you tell your story, you are participating in a tradition older than written history. Africa's first storytellers didn't just speak to be heard. They spoke to be understood, to connect, to heal. They believed that language was the bridge between the physical and the spiritual. between what is and what could be. And that philosophy still shapes how we use words today, to inspire, to love, to teach, and to understand the African origin of language is to understand the origin of humanity's greatest tool, communication. Every time you speak truth, every time you teach, every time you sing, you are honoring that legacy. You are continuing the story that began thousands of years ago in the cradle of civilization. It is a reminder that Africa's contributions cannot be erased because they live within the sound of your voice, the rhythm of your words, the music of your thoughts. All carry the essence of the first human who looked up at the stars and decided to name them. Language is not just sound, it is memory, identity, and creation, and that memory began in Africa. The next time you speak, remember that you are not merely using words, you are using a power that your ancestors created. The next time you hear a melody or a chant, understand that it echoes a truth as old as humanity itself, that Africa taught the world how to speak, how to connect, and how to express the very soul of existence. Africa's first gift to the world was life, and its second was the ability to share that life through the miracle of language. From those ancient voices to yours, the chain remains unbroken. The story continues every time you open your mouth and speak truth into the world. Every language spoken today carries an echo of Africa's first voice, a whisper from the dawn of humanity, when sound became the first bridge between minds. Before there were alphabets or written words, there was tone, rhythm, and vibration, the language of the earth itself. In the heart of Africa, where humanity took its first breath, the earliest humans began to shape meaning out of sound. The rustle of leaves, the murmur of water, the call of birds, all became symbols of understanding. Communication was born not from noise, but from the deep need to connect, to express thought, emotion, and truth. It was in Africa's soil that words took form, and from that ancient land, they spread to every corner of the earth. Imagine those first communities gathered beneath vast skies, their hearts beating with the rhythm of creation. They learned to mimic the world around them, transforming sound into symbols and symbols into meaning. They named the stars, the rivers, and the animals. They gave identity to life itself. Language became their mirror, a reflection of thought and spirit. These early expressions were not just functional, they were sacred. The power to name something was the power to give it life. Every syllable carried the vibration of existence, and in that vibration, the foundation of human consciousness was laid. From Kemet to Nubia, from the Nile to the Congo, Africa's civilizations were built on the strength of speech. Words were more than tools, they were instruments of creation. In ancient Kemet, speech was seen as divine energy, something capable of shaping reality itself. To speak truth was to summon it into being. This philosophy spread through the ages, carried by those who understood that the voice is humanity's greatest power. When an African elder spoke, it wasn't merely conversation, it was wisdom transmitted through vibration. Each proverb carried generations of experience. Each chant carried memory, and each story carried identity. Linguists and historians today trace nearly all major languages back to the African continent. The earliest linguistic structures, the clicks, the tones, the patterns of meaning originated there. Even today, the world's oldest known languages, such as those of the San people, preserve sounds that once echoed across the plains tens of thousands of years ago. Those ancient tongues formed the root systems from which modern languages grew. When you speak any word from mama to love, you are unknowingly repeating a rhythm that was first spoken by your ancestors on African soil. Africa is not just the birthplace of humanity, it is the birthplace of expression, of dialogue, of meaning. What makes this revelation powerful is that it redefines how we see civilization. The world has often been taught that progress began in other lands, that thought, logic, and language were gifts of Europe or Asia. But truth has a way of finding its voice. Science now confirms what our ancestors always knew. Africa was the first teacher, the first philosopher, the first poet, the first storyteller. They were African. Long before writing appeared on stone tablets or papyrus, stories were passed from tongue to ear, carried by rhythm and tone. These oral traditions became the heartbeat of culture, the blueprint for history, and the foundation of all that would come after. The story of language is the story of resilience. Through colonization, enslavement, and displacement, the African voice was targeted because it held power. The oppressors knew that to silence a people's tongue was to weaken their identity. Yet even when African languages were forbidden, their rhythm endured. It lived on in the songs of the enslaved, in the cadences of Creole, in the pulse of the drum. The syntax may have changed, but the spirit of African speech could not be erased. It became the backbone of new cultures, new expressions, and new movements. Every shout for freedom, every poem of resistance, every gospel note sung in pain or triumph carries that same ancestral vibration, the echo of Africa's first word. Language has always been more than sound. It is memory, identity, and freedom. When Africans were scattered across the world, their voices became seeds. They took root in new lands, blending with other tongues, birthing dialects that carried traces of their origin. You can hear it in the rhythm of the Caribbean, in the tone of African American vernacular, in the melodies of Brazil, in the expressions of the diaspora. The African voice is global. It lives in laughter, in storytelling, in music, in prayer. It is the invisible thread connecting past to present, reminding us that no matter where we go, we carry home in our speech. To understand the African origin of language is to recognize that communication is more than words. It is energy. When we speak, we do not merely convey thought, we transmit vibration. This understanding was central to African philosophy. Speech was considered a form of creation, an act that could shape destiny. Even today, we feel this truth in everyday life. A kind word can heal, a hateful word can wound. The way we speak determines the world we build. Our ancestors knew this instinctively. They taught that the voice is sacred, and that words must be chosen with wisdom, because each one carries the power to give life or destroy it. This ancient wisdom is not lost. It lives within us. When we speak truth, we awaken it. When we tell our stories, we honor it. When we teach others to listen deeply, we revive the rhythm of our ancestors. Language is not just history. It is a living inheritance. Every conversation we have is a continuation of the first dialogue that ever took place in Africa's cradle. The human voice is the oldest instrument, and every time it is used with purpose, it plays the same song of unity that began thousands of years ago. Africa's gift to the world was not only life but the ability to express that life. From the first word uttered in the shadow of the baobab tree to the speeches, songs and stories that move the world today, that legacy endures. It reminds us that we are all connected by sound, by rhythm, by meaning. Every language, no matter how different, carries a trace of that first voice. Every story told in any corner of the world is part of a much greater narrative, the story of humanity finding its tongue through Africa. So when you speak, know that you are not alone. You are continuing an unbroken chain of expression that began before time was recorded. Your words carry the DNA of the ancestors who first named the world. Their spirit lives in every sound you make. The African origin of language is not just history. It is proof that within every human being lies the same eternal rhythm, the same sacred vibration that once turned silence into connection. That is the miracle of speech, and that miracle was born from Africa's heart. Every language spoken today, in every land and every voice, is an echo of that first song, a song that still calls us to remember who we are and where we began. They called it civilization, but Africa had already given the world its words. Long before empires rose from marble and stone, before philosophers began to debate the meaning of life, there was a voice that echoed across the plains of Africa. It was the voice of the first humans, our ancestors shaping sound into meaning, turning vibration into communication. It began with the heartbeat of the earth, the rhythm of the wind, the whisper of rivers, and the pulse of life itself. Africa spoke first and the world learned to listen. Every language we speak today carries a faint memory of that origin, a trace of the continent that gave the world its first words. Imagine the earliest people gathered beneath a golden African sky, watching the sun fade into the horizon. In that silence, they began to imitate the sounds around them. The call of birds, the roar of lions, the rustle of trees. Slowly, those sounds turned into symbols, and symbols into words. With words, they built relationships, communities, and understanding. They learned to name what they saw, to express what they felt, and to pass knowledge from one generation to another. Language became the spark that separated humanity from the rest of creation. It gave humans the power to dream, to imagine, and to create. It all began on African soil. When we talk about language, we are not just talking about communication, we are talking about identity, about the ability to define ourselves and the world around us. In ancient Africa, language was sacred. Words were not thrown carelessly into the air. They were considered energy, life, and power. The elders understood that to speak was to shape reality. That is why African proverbs are so profound. They are not just sayings, they are keys to wisdom, compressed with generations of truth. When an elder spoke, their words carried the weight of ancestors. Each sound had rhythm, each pause had meaning, and every story carried life lessons designed to guide the heart and soul. Africa's languages were born from the observation of nature, the balance of the universe, and the harmony of existence. The rhythm of the drum mirrored the rhythm of speech, creating a link between language and music. This connection still lives today in every African tongue, in every song that tells a story, and in every chant that calls upon unity. Language and sound became the heartbeat of culture, and from that heartbeat, civilization found its rhythm. The art of oratory, speaking with emotion, power, and wisdom, was perfected in Africa long before it became a skill admired elsewhere. When you trace back human speech, linguists agree that nearly every language on earth shares roots that lead back to Africa. The ancient San people of southern Africa still speak some of the world's oldest languages, rich in clicks and tones that carry deep historical significance. These are not random sounds, they are echoes of humanity's earliest communication. From the Nile to the Sahara, from the rainforests of the Congo to the plains of Kenya, early Africans developed complex systems of communication that shaped thought itself. And from those systems, as people migrated across continents, the foundation of modern language was born. But Africa's voice was more than a means of communication. It was a source of spiritual connection. Language carried energy. To speak was to create. The people of Kemet, known today as ancient Egypt, believed that the spoken word could bring things into existence. To name something was to give it form, to give it life. This philosophy spread throughout the continent and became the foundation for African storytelling and oral tradition. To this day, when an African griot speaks, they are not simply telling a story, they are invoking memory, ancestry, and power. The voice becomes an instrument of creation, and the listener becomes a participant in the act of remembering. The tragedy of history is that for centuries, Africa's voice was silenced, rewritten, or dismissed. Colonization and enslavement didn't just take land or freedom, they attacked language. They replaced native tongues with foreign ones, hoping to erase culture and identity. But language, like spirit, cannot be fully destroyed. Even when the African tongue was forbidden, its rhythm lived on in the hymns sung in the fields, in the dialects formed in the Caribbean, in the spiritual songs and poetry of the Diaspora. The tone, cadence, and pattern of African speech survived every attempt to erase it. The enslaved may have been taken from Africa, but Africa was never taken from them. Every time we speak in rhythm, every time we tell a story, every time our words carry soul, we are keeping that legacy alive. African speech patterns shape the way the world communicates today. The lyrical nature of African languages influenced the way we sing, the way we preach, the way we tell stories, and the way we motivate. You can hear Africa in jazz, in reggae, in hip-hop, in blues. You can hear Africa in the way a grandmother tells a story, in the way a leader inspires a crowd, in the way communities express emotion through speech. The African voice still defines how humanity communicates passion, emotion, and truth. Language is more than history, it is power. The ability to speak truth into existence is one of humanity's most divine gifts. The first humans understood this long before any modern civilization did. They knew that words could heal or harm, build or destroy. That is why African wisdom teaches that the tongue has power. What you say determines the world you create. Our ancestors spoke life because they understood that sound shapes reality. Even today, when we speak words of hope, we are echoing the same vibration that once turned silence into meaning. It is no coincidence that the world's oldest forms of poetry, storytelling, and philosophy were African. The continent's oral traditions preserved history long before it was written. The griots, sages, and elders acted as living libraries, holding centuries of knowledge within their words. Through them, language became a bridge between generations, linking the living with those who came before. That is why even today, in many African cultures, storytelling is sacred. It is not just entertainment, it is education, preservation, and connection. So when people say civilization began elsewhere, they overlook the truth. Civilization began the moment humans learned to communicate, to share knowledge, and to pass wisdom. That happened first in Africa. The pyramids, the philosophy, the mathematics, all of it began with the ability to express an idea. The world's first conversations about existence, morality, and purpose were spoken under African sky. The power of speech, the magic of words, the poetry of life. They were Africa's gift to the world. And so when we speak today, we must remember that we are carrying the same energy our ancestors once held. Every word we say carries a trace of that original power. To speak is to honor them. To teach, to tell stories, to inspire. That is how we continue their legacy. Africa gave the world the gift of voice, and it is our responsibility to use that gift with purpose, pride, and truth. The world may have forgotten where its words were born, but history always finds a way to speak again. Africa's voice was never lost. It was only waiting for the world to listen.